Detroit, 1966. Late autumn. The kind of cold that gets into the walls of a building and never fully leaves. Studio A at Hitsville. USA wasn't glamorous. It was a converted garage on West Grand Boulevard, small enough that engineers had to watch where they stood. The ceiling was low, the equipment was good, and the sound that came out of that room had been making people cry and dance and fall in love for the better part of a decade. Marvin Gaye had been in that room hundreds of times. He knew where the floor creaked, which microphone his voice liked best, the smell of cigarettes and machine oil that never fully left. He was comfortable there in a way he wasn't comfortable almost anywhere else. That afternoon, he had just finished a take. One take. The band was still settling when Marvin stepped back from the microphone and turned to look through the glass at Norman Whitfield. Whitfield was Motown's hitmaker. Not a hitmaker, the hitmaker. He had a formula, and he understood it better than almost anyone alive. Tempo, hook, production texture. He knew what radio wanted before radio knew it wanted it. He had delivered hit after hit, and Berry Gordy trusted him completely. Whitfield sat in the control room with his arms folded. He had listened to the playback once. He pressed stop. He didn't rewind it. He sat there for a moment, the room quiet except for the hiss of the tape machine, then stood up, said something brief to the engineer, and walked out. He hadn't looked at Marvin when he left. The engineer didn't say much. He didn't have to. Marvin could read a room. He stood next to the microphone for another minute, listening to the silence where feedback should have been, and then he reached out and pressed play on the monitor himself. The song came back through the speakers, his voice, that guitar opening, the drum pattern underneath everything like a slow heartbeat that had something wrong with it, something slightly off-center in a way that made you keep listening. He stood there and listened to it alone. He thought, this is the best thing I have ever recorded. Norman Whitfield's problem with the track wasn't that it was bad. The problem was that it didn't fit the formula he was building at Motown that year. The label had a sound, a specific, carefully maintained sound. Clean, bright, hopeful, even when the subject matter wasn't. Marvin's version of Grapevine was something else entirely. It was slow, almost uncomfortably slow. It sat in its own dread. The voice didn't soar over the arrangement. It crawled through it, like something wounded that still had somewhere to be. Whitfield didn't think radio would play it. He didn't think the Motown audience would accept it. He may have been half right on both counts. It wasn't what they expected. That much was true. But there's a difference between unexpected and wrong, and Whitfield, for all his gifts, didn't pause long enough to figure out which one he was looking at. He shelved the recording and moved on. He had other projects, other artists, and a song he believed in needed somewhere to go. He gave it to Gladys Knight and the Pips. Their version was different, tighter, more urgent, less interior. It had the production signature Whitfield preferred, something you could identify in the first 5 seconds as a Motown record. Gladys Knight sang it beautifully. Nobody who heard it could argue with that. It came out in 1967 and went to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Motown was pleased. Whitfield was pleased. The formula had worked again. Marvin heard it on the radio. He didn't say much about it at the time. Not publicly. The people around him noticed that he went quiet for a few days after it charted, but that wasn't unusual for him. Marvin went quiet sometimes. He had moods that could close off a room without anyone understanding why. His wife Anna noticed. Berry Gordy probably noticed too, and knew better than to push. What Marvin was thinking in those quiet days, only Marvin knew. But there's a version of it that makes sense. The version where a man hears his own work being celebrated under someone else's name. And something inside him just goes absolutely still. Not angry, not loud, just still. The way something goes still right before it becomes permanent. 2 years passed. In 1968, Motown released an album called In the Groove. It was Marvin's record, and it was good. Commercially solid, critically decent. But buried inside it, not promoted, not highlighted, was the recording from Studio A in 1966. They included it in the track list almost as an afterthought, the way you might include something because you paid for it and it would be wasteful not to. Nobody at the label expected anything from it. And then something strange happened. A radio DJ in the Midwest pulled the album off the shelf and listened through it one afternoon. Maybe he was bored. Maybe someone had mentioned it to him. Whatever the reason, he got to that track, Marvin's version of Grapevine, and he played it on air. His phone lines locked up within minutes. He played it again. Same thing. He called a friend at another station. That station played it. Same response. Word spread the way it always spreads when something is genuinely real. Person to person, station to station, city by city, until it was moving faster than any marketing campaign could have managed. Listeners weren't just requesting it, they were calling to ask what it was. Why hadn't they heard it before? Why wasn't it a single? Motown started getting letters, then calls, then pressure from distributors who understood exactly what the numbers from radio play meant. Berry Gordy released it as a single in September 1968. By the end of the year, it had sold over 4 million copies in the United States alone. 4 million. It was the biggest selling single in Motown's entire history up to that point. Nothing the label had ever released had moved like that. Not the early Miracles records, not the Four Tops at their commercial peak, not even the Supremes at their most dominant. The record that Norman Whitfield had decided wasn't right for radio had just set a record that Motown wouldn't break for years. Here's what's worth sitting with for a moment. Whitfield wasn't incompetent. He wasn't petty or small-minded. He was, by every reasonable measure, one of the best producers working in American music at that time. The fact that he heard Marvin's Grapevine and decided it wasn't right wasn't a failure of talent. It was a failure of imagination, the kind it takes to hear something genuinely new and recognize it for what it is, rather than measure it against what already existed. That's a different kind of mistake, and in some ways it's the harder one because it's invisible until it isn't. The formula was real. It had worked. It had produced an extraordinary number of hits over an extraordinary number of years. But a formula is also a set of assumptions, and assumptions have a way of becoming the ceiling of what you're willing to try. Whitfield looked at Marvin's recording and heard something that didn't fit. What he didn't ask was whether the thing that didn't fit might be exactly what was needed. Marvin had been asking that question his whole career. Not out loud. He rarely made arguments in words when he could make them in music. But in every session where he pushed against what Motown wanted, in every recording that sat at the edge of what the label's formula allowed, he was asking it, quietly, persistently, with the patience of someone who has learned that being right too early looks identical to being wrong. The worst part of those 2 years wasn't the silence around his recording. It was the noise around someone else's version of it. Every time Grapevine came on the radio in Gladys Knight's voice, Marvin had to sit with something most people never have to confront directly. The knowledge that what you built is real, that it works, that it connects, just not in your hands, just not with your name attached. He never talked about what that felt like. The silence around that period in his life is almost total, which, if you know anything about Marvin Gaye, tells you more than words would have anyway. The Grammy nominations came out that February. His version of Grapevine didn't win. The awards machinery hadn't caught up yet, and the timeline was complicated by when the recording had officially been released. But inside the industry, the conversation had already shifted. Producers who had been working within the same parameters as Whitfield were listening to those 4 minutes differently now. Something about the tempo, something about the way the voice sat underneath the arrangement instead of riding on top of it, something about the restraint that Whitfield had read as a commercial problem and 4 million listeners had heard as a reason to turn up the volume. Norman Whitfield didn't speak publicly about what had happened. He was a professional, and professionals don't explain decisions that turned out to be wrong. He kept producing. The Temptations' psychedelic soul era was largely his creation, and that work was genuinely brilliant on its own terms. But the people who worked at Hitsville in those years remember the way the office felt in late 1968. The way Marvin carried himself through those hallways with a quietness that had something different in it than his usual quietness. Not gloating, not performing vindication. Just a man who knew what he had made, who had always known, and who no longer needed anyone else to confirm it. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs to being right about something important when the world couldn't hear it yet. Marvin knew that silence well. He had lived inside it before, and he would live inside it again, in different rooms, over different recordings, fighting different versions of the same argument. But in the winter of 1968, with 4 million copies sold and a record that had broken every internal benchmark Motown had ever set, that silence finally had a number attached to it. Some things don't need to be said out loud. The chart positions said it. The sales figures said it. The radio DJs who had jammed their phone lines trying to find out what this song was and where it had been all their lives said it. The song itself had been saying it since 1966. It had just been sitting in an archive, waiting for the world to be ready. Decades later, I heard it through the grapevine would appear on virtually every serious list of essential American recordings. Music historians would write about what made it different from everything else being released at that time. The slowness that shouldn't have worked on commercial radio but did. The voice moving through the track at its own pace, completely indifferent to what anyone expected. Norman Whitfield would receive full production credit on every reissue and anniversary edition. Technically, that was accurate. He built the template the track was recorded on. His name belonged there. But somewhere in that story is a 2-year gap, a period where the recording sat in an archive because one man in a control room had pressed stop and walked out without looking back. And in that gap is the whole lesson. Not about talent, not about any individual being smarter or more gifted than another. Just about what happens when someone makes something true and the world isn't ready yet, and they have to wait for the world to catch up. Marvin waited. He didn't have much choice, but he waited with the knowledge that he was right, and that kind of knowledge is a specific companion to carry. It doesn't make the waiting easy. It just gives you something solid to stand on when everything else feels uncertain. In 1968, standing at the edge of 4 million sold, that was more than enough. Have you ever made something real and watched the world walk right past it? Tell us in the comments.